Welcome to the FCS, a part of FCS Fans Nation, where we go down all the jackrabbit holes, are loaded with hotter takes in the inferno, and have a bigger crown than Duke Dog himself. The show you didn't want, you definitely didn't need, but here you are. Let's get into this. What's going on, FCS Fans Nation, and welcome back to the FCS, aka the Football Chris Show, because my name fits conveniently in the middle. Joining me today, I have Will Seiler of, Around the A-Sun. I guess we don't have a UCA Bears podcast yet, but
no, not yet.
Chumbling around, and possibly the best place kicker outside of Moscow, Idaho, I've heard.
Well, that's too bad because I'm not a kicker, Chris.
I said, sorry, dang it, holder.
Yeah,
holder.
Holder
I was trying to rep the brand, and I failed right off the bat. So I guess we'll move past that. But Will and I had a good time down in Frisco this last year. Got to meet when I was coming up with this idea of what we'll be talking about today of rest versus rust, which has kind of been a subject all the way back to when teams started announcing, no, we're playing in the fall, aka hence why Will is on here. He was a part of the fall season for the UCA Bears. We have a couple other teams like Houston Baptist, Stephen F. Austin, and such that did do more of the fall. Eastern Kentucky did the fall thing, right? They're kind of your baseline. They play it as close to a regular schedule as possible. Then you have basically the teams that decided they were going to risk rust. That would be your Abilene Christians, your Alcorn States, Bethune-Cookman, Campbell, Central Connecticut State University, Dayton, Florida A&M, Georgetown, Hampton, Indiana State was a big one, Marist, Montana State, Morgan State, NCA&T, NC North Carolina Central University. Man, we got a lot of abbreviated names. Northern Colorado, Portland State, Sac State, St. Francis, SFA, Towson. Well, I guess SFA played to the UCA, but Towson and UNA. And then obviously you have people like Cal Poly that backed out middle of the spring season. You had Portland State, Montana that still played one or two games. But for the most part, those are your teams that sacrificed rust to not play in the spring. Meanwhile, the rest of the FCS kind of did the whole we're going to give it our best shot. Even though you had a couple teams that kind of bailed, like Chattanooga left midseason, Illinois State, Cal Poly, Albany, Wofford, Western Illinois, New Hampshire, and Youngstown all at some point bailed within the spring season. So you have a little bit of a hybrid where they geared up for a full spring season, got into it, and failed. So before we kind of just get into it, kind of talking like pros, cons, how we think this might settle, I just want to talk to you, former player that went through a la the most common type of season we could have had by playing in the fall. What do you think playing in the fall benefited? And your initial take maybe before the season started on who might benefit more, the teams that rested or the teams that were sacrificing rest? We're sacrificing rest over sacrificing rust.
Well, here's my thing. College athletes are people of habit and rhythm. And I think one thing about playing in the fall, you keep that normal rhythm, a little bit normal, like hierarchy within your program. You're not having hey, this guy's got like 5 years of eligibility, this guy's got 3. So there's a little less confusion when it comes to that kind of thing as far as eligibility goes. But like I said, it's a rhythm deal. Playing in the spring and then turning around, starting summer practice is hard. And one thing I was talking to some guys at Sam Houston, I mean, they got like 2 or 3 weeks off and they were back at it. And so that's hard to do. But I think UCA kind of got just doing a normal season in general, it just makes it a little easier to jump back in, do some spring ball. You're not getting fed up with football. I know it's easy. Like, we're college athletes. We love playing football, but it's easy to get tired of it toward the end of the season, especially if you're not playing for anything. And so I think just having that sense of rhythm is good for teams. But then you look at like Montana, they look like they never skipped a beat and they hadn't played in 2 years. And so it's a balancing act, but I think that the rhythm and the being able to get into a rhythm and habit for us was a big deal.
Yeah. And we'll kind of get into this. We're going to start going through the schedule here a little bit on like what's already happened, what's going to happen, etc. But I mean, that's kind of how I viewed it. I think the spring probably did throw a little bit of a wrench in some people's plans, but just like I also think the people that missed the spring, like I think they're obviously that's why there's an argument to be had, right? It's like both things kind of went against habit, where like one team decided, all right, we're going to practice, but there's no football, and one team's like, all right, we're just going to try to shift the calendar year. And I wasn't a D1 football athlete, but I'm assuming like springtime rolls around, you kind of your body naturally goes into more of like a spring ball mode than like okay, we're gonna like have live action, so there was a lot to probably work out. I know I lent more towards, I think the teams that played in the spring, we're going to see a very initial benefit, possibly why we saw some of these FBS upsets. They were more fresh than their FBS sides who played in the fall as normal. But then at the same time, I think that's where the Rust teams have to shake off 600 days of not playing. I mean, we all see first game jitters every single time they go out. There's always that like, we'll see how this goes. There's always weird, fumbling on the one or false starts, holding, just weird little things that kind of come out week one where you thought, okay, these teams that went with the Rust method are probably going to experience a little bit more of that because not only have they not played in 365 days, closer to 600. So there's those pros and cons, but then when they work that all out, their bodies will be fresh at the end of the season. So this argument is by no means going away, but we're just going to try to do our best, a little bit of sampling at it currently, because when the end of the season rolls around and all the teams that sacrificed rest, your Sam Houston, South Dakota States, North Dakota States, whoever, possibly get knocked out of the playoffs early. And then you have the likes of like a Montana State, who else on this list? Maybe Eastern Kentucky, NCA&T, like maybe some of these teams, Stephen F. Austin, make a run. UCA as kind of like that, baseline. They make a deep run into the playoffs. We're like, okay, well, these guys, it's because their bodies were still there, hip and fresh. So by no means us covering this week one, between week 1 and week 2 is going to be the end all be all of this conversation, I'm sure, but it sure as hell is probably going to draw some clicks. So, and I'm glad I waited. I was going to do this week 0. I had a swamped week last week. It works out better that it's post week 1 because as you hinted on, we have some results to go over.
Exactly.
But we do have so far one direct matchup of Rest versus Rust, where Indiana State, kind of the initial team to really like opt out of the spring in terms of like they said they were going to play. The whole rest of the conference said they're going to play, and they kind of pulled out earliest. Indiana State going against Eastern Illinois. Indiana State gets the 26-21 5-point victory over the Panthers in Illinois. So, the first matchup went to the team that sacrificed having a little bit of rust. So I'm not what I said, right? Like I thought the team that went without rest, like EIU, would probably do a little bit better because everything was more fresh. And then right out the gates, that kind of sideswiped us. With it being one direct game, I just want to, before we get into all the other matchups that are coming up, do you think there's going to be, like, you can actually take something away from this direct matchup of Rest versus Rust, or it's just Indiana State was just playing out in simple a better team than Eastern Illinois?
Well, I kind of think the latter, just because your sample size is 1. It's not enough to like see a trend, and like you said, it makes sense that the earlier season matchups would go toward the teams that have played more recently, gotten more game reps. You ask any coach, they'll tell you that game reps are the biggest blessing for a practice. Like those guys that were playing in April, like when UCA was doing spring ball, hitting each other, they were hitting other teams. That's huge. That's a big deal. And so I don't think you can take a whole lot away from it. Week 1, I think it was just, the better team won the game. Because I think as we get into a higher sample size, though, especially early in the season, I think you'll probably be right that the teams that played in the spring will have more early success than the teams that didn't.
Yeah, and it's going to be really interesting because obviously, as we mentioned, some of these conferences, you're going to get a few of these direct matchups, the Missouri Valley being one of them. Indiana State is going to have to play, without having their schedule directly in front of me, somewhere along the likes of North Dakota, South Dakota State, South Dakota, NDSU, right? Like Missouri State. These teams, Missouri State, talk about a team that benefited from the spring. We'll see if it hurts them in the fall. So you see that, but then you touch on it like then once again, we're going back to these teams that had the rust. Montana was not supposed to beat Washington. And Washington played not a lot, but they did play in the Pac-12, in the fall season. Obviously, due to COVID and everything, did not play in the championship game, but still got some reps under their belt. And in theory, are more like, UCA, where they're that normal baseline of a team. Meanwhile, you have Montana, new quarterback of all things, too. 600 days, goes to their place, becomes like the fourth FCS upset of a top 20 team of all time or something like that. That wasn't supposed to happen. So here I am, the guy who's saying I think early on the teams with this rest are going to benefit, or the teams that sacrifice rest are going to benefit because of fresh reps, and the teams with rust are just going to come out overly rusty. But then you have Montana beating Montana beating Washington. You have Montana State hanging close against Wyoming. You have Northern Iowa hanging close against Iowa State. You have East Tennessee beating Vanderbilt. Like, I guess that one's a little bit less because ETSU played, right? But like Montana State hanging in there against Wyoming and Montana beating Washington are big results for the rust crowd that, 600 days off, and they came out ready to play almost as if they didn't, they didn't sacrifice any time away from the ball.
It's just hard to say this early. I think as we go later into the season, you'll start seeing injuries because rest is important, not just, 1 week going into the next, but long periods. Like I said, they started summer workouts in Huntsville at Sam Houston literally a month after they played, and with no like spring ball, rest, because spring ball is not that, taxing on your body. But I think as we go later, you'll start to see what you're thinking you're going to see. So,
yeah, man, I'm trying to pull up some of these like future matchups we got this week to kind of look at it. This problem of running an unscripted show is sometimes you got to really fly from the cuff. But a lot of these, like Cal Poly at Fresno State, like that shouldn't matter. Western Illinois is one of those hybrids. They're playing at Montana, so you kind of get the hybrid method. That one. Central Arkansas against Missouri State, so you get your boys kind of playing a team that benefited in the spring. So you're getting regular old fall. Because correct me if I'm wrong, you guys got 10 games in the fall, or did you get all 11?
We had 10 scheduled. We played 9 because Louisiana canceled on us.
Okay, so for all intents and purposes, you basically played as close to a regular full season as you could.
Right.
Let's see who else we got. Austin Peay versus Ole Miss. The problem is we're still in all these FBS matchups. So, like, you don't really learn anything unless you're like Montana and you pull off the upset. Because then you have, like, keeping ETSU over Vanderbilt. Like, is that because there's that whole rest thing? Like, ETSU can beat a Vanderbilt, not just because they're a better team than Vanderbilt, the obvious answer there, but because everything's more fresh for them. Or the Eastern Washington Eagles being able to beat UNLV. UC Davis being able to beat Tulsa. Like, those are all games that kind of happen. UNI being able to hang with Iowa State are games because they were fresh. So you still have the rest argument to be made. It's just, man, that Montana game kind of really put a wrench in the plan. And then you have this Indiana State just straight up against one in week 0. And it's, I don't know, it appears to me that like maybe the rust might have been the method to go with. I'm trying to stall here. So I guess if you want to run over that while I try to find some future matchups we can look at for this again.
I'll say this about Montana. They've been looking forward to that game ever since they announced they weren't playing in the spring. That's their Super Bowl. Now, I'm not saying Washington's not been looking forward to the start of football season, but there's something to be said for emotional hype when it comes to a big game like, a game against UW. That's probably would have been, even if they had just played them close, that would have been one of the biggest games in Montana football history. And so them doing that, like they've been looking forward to that game for 2 years, or I guess a year and a half since they announced they weren't playing in the spring. And so it doesn't surprise me necessarily that they kept it close, but it does surprise me that they won the game, obviously, just because it's UW against Montana. But we'll see. I had a matchup that I was going to talk about, and then I forgot which one it was. I should have wrote it down.
Yeah. Well, I found one in week 3. We got Northern Colorado hosting Lamar. Northern Colorado also secretly acquired. This is kind of turning into an FBS versus FCS episode,
right.
But it's because it's all we have to compare at this point. I'm sure there'll be a follow up to this as the season draws further along. But now you're looking at Northern Colorado's hosting Lamar. Northern Colorado has a better than expected performance against the University of Colorado last weekend. Like you're looking at this week 3 against similar competition. Is this one of those games they can pull off? They also play Houston Baptist this week. So once again, a kind of team that played in the fall. Obviously, Bailey Zappi putting on a show that most people remember from Houston Baptist in the fall. But so you'll get a couple of Northern Colorado out of the gate, gets a couple against the baseline, and then Lamar, who played in the spring. I'm trying to roll through these, and it's just so hard early on because there's literally like 128 matchups because nobody's playing one another. Like Portland State, they're playing Western Oregon, so that sucks.
Just kind of pick your brain here. Who do you think the rest method, sacrificing rest, benefits the most? Because a team like Missouri State, to me, that's a team that was on the come up in the fall. I mean, they gave us a run for our money twice, 2 close games. Bobby Petrino trying to get his system in and everything like that. Is that best for a team like them who loves game speed reps, trying to implement an offense, new coaching staff, things like that, as opposed to somebody like, I don't know, try to think of the most veteran team. Like we were a pretty old team, but we didn't sacrifice rest. So I don't know any off the top of my head.
Like at Eastern Washington, maybe.
Yeah.
Barry is a senior, Limu Jones, Andrew Boston, all those guys are upperclassmen.
Like, did it really matter for a team like that versus a team like Missouri State who's trying to they're on the come up, and so any games that they do accelerates that progress.
Yeah, I think that's where you're going to see it for sure. Is Missouri State is on the come up, so their expectations are also still a little lower. They have that benefit going for them. Like if they do have a bad year, it's easier to sell that fan base on. Well, that's because we made such a push in the spring. But you're getting those live game reps, like you mentioned, which are so crucial that, it benefits a team like Missouri State because they get all these guys in. Where a team like Eastern Washington, you're sacrificing more of that rest because if your guys get hurt, this team is built around winning now, per se. Where Missouri State is built on we're building something. And I think that's also where you see the rust benefit some schools like Montana State. Montana and Montana State, the joke in the Big Sky Podcast Network for not the fans of their teams was Montana didn't play because it was snows in Missoula. They didn't play because they didn't have a quarterback. Montana State didn't play in the spring not because it snows in Bozeman. They didn't play because their coach left 6 weeks before the season started, and they also didn't have a quarterback. So it's like we don't have indoor facilities, but neither does Eastern Washington, and they played. Neither does. I guess, most of those schools are warmer after that. But Weber State, for example, right? Like it snows in those places and they played. So there were teams that also benefit from the rust, like a Montana. They had time to figure it out and obviously figured it out really well and really, really quick. Obviously Florida A&M, not so much. Jackson State, who played in the spring. So I guess we got that one also to compare that I missed. So Jackson won that one. So we have one rest. You're just trying to find
how many games did New Hampshire play in the spring? I know the CAA didn't play very many.
Yeah, I see 2020.
They're playing Towson. So we'll get a game this weekend. Because I don't think Towson played.
I have them at one game. Yeah, they lost to you. 2020, New Hampshire lost to Albany 24-20, and then had everything else canceled.
Okay, I didn't think they played very much, but so I don't really play into the argument.
No, but it's because then you got another one. Towson has North Dakota State, and we was at 4-3. But that's going to be one where North Dakota State should just win that. If anything, if Towson wins that, it shows that maybe this rest thing is real. Right. But then most North Dakota State people would argue that, well, the thing they wanted rested was their quarterback, and they got a brand new one. so it shouldn't affect them too much. I guess you got Stephen F. Austin versus Mississippi Valley State. Tarleton State versus Southern Utah, but they both played. North Alabama has JSU, and North Alabama took the rest method, right?
They did.
So you got that week too. JSU possibly on the ropes. Golly. So I'm just going to
Chattanooga played part of a spring season, and they got North Alabama.
Yeah.
Good one.
Solid worker on the FCS show where you just go full wing it, and then on the one and it's worked every other episode, and then you get to this one, and you're like, yeah, I probably should have made a list of all the exact upcoming matchups we could be looking at here. Oh boy, you got a humdinger in week 4, Montana versus Cal Poly, the team that dropped out after 3 games. And then obviously you get the Ivy Leagues kind of starting up because they also all didn't play, but they only get 1 week now where they play anybody but themselves.
Yeah, they're kind of keep to themselves.
Yeah, so I mean, gosh, now you're getting in the conference play, so you're looking at basically those couple of schools here and there. Bethune-Cookman at Alabama State. Man. Anyways, I think people get the point. We have some upcoming matchups. Maybe I'll release a list or whatever. So to kind of, I guess, close out this little quick episode that turned into a train wreck quickly. Currently, looking at the rest of the season, when the dust all settles, is Rest versus Rust going to be in anything we keep track of? And if so, which one do you favor to have the advantage when we're in Frisco in January?
Here's the deal. I think the teams that are going to be in Frisco are just good enough to be there, whether they rested or they didn't. And so I don't know that it's going to be just screaming at us in the face saying, hey, these teams that rested are there, these teams that sat around or that played in the spring are not. But I do think I like numbers. And when the NBA played that season and a half, during the full season following the little bubble season that they played, injuries were through the roof. It was the highest rate of injuries since they kept track of it. And so I do think the teams along the lines of Montana and teams that played the previous fall will be more likely to stay healthy and then subsequently make a deep run in the playoffs. But I don't know that it matters enough because I think the teams that are going to be there are going to be the best teams, whether they rested or rusted, either way, or did both, I guess. And so I guess if you rest, you do rest. But, yeah, I think that, somebody like North Dakota State might just be good enough to make it back there. Somebody like Montana, though, we've seen them so good. I do think, though, the teams that have the rest are going to be more likely to make deep runs in the playoffs. And so if we do see a trend, I think that's where it'll trend towards.
Yeah, and you have the off-ball situations, too, like you look at South Dakota State, right? Obviously, asterisk on the season, whatever you want to do, I don't care. At this point, they made it to a championship game, depending on whether people put an asterisk in front of it or not, and looked like they probably had a good shot to win it until they lose Gronowski. So, there's your big rest argument right there. Some teams to make that push for 2020, which, I think you pull most South Dakota State fans, 99% of them will say they would not trade it for anything in the world. Even though they lost the championship game, they can't guarantee another trip to the championship game. So they will take the fact that they got there. But obviously losing Gronowski hurts them. I know they're all really high on Chris Oladokin.
Yeah, I was gonna say if they didn't have a decent quarterback coming in to that they thought was gonna be a great replacement, they might feel a little differently about it. If they had a scrub coming in to try and take over for Gronowski, I think he'd be talking a different way.
Yeah, I'm still holding off judgment. It's week 1. South Dakota State's still not in my top 5. I know they just smoked Colorado State, everybody, so you can stop typing now. But I'll hold off week 1, try not to get too big into this stuff. I think we did some math on the Big Sky Podcast Network. There's been 13 schools that have had an FBS win in the Big Sky, and 8 of them missed the playoffs or something like that. So beating FBS school doesn't always mean you're that good. Sometimes you just get up for big games. But South Dakota State does look like they're still going to be a playoff team at least.
Yeah.
A championship game, if Old Oaken plays like he did, yeah, of course. But I don't know. I'm looking at that, and I think you're right. I think rust is going to shake off. It's what you do every year, right? It's just a little bit more rust. Every year somebody starts rusty with the 360 days off or whatever, 300-ish. So rust is something not new for teams. Maybe they have a little bit more of it. It might take a little bit longer to shake off, but you're going to have that time to rebound because those teams that sacrifice rest, if what we've seen is true, are going to start dropping more and more like flies. Because, I mean, you hit it. Everyone likes to admit that when they were 20, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, with extra year of eligibility, possibly 24, 25. But they could take a hit and get right back up. But, like, that's not football hit. Yeah, I remember when I was 14, 15, 16, 17, in high school. Yeah, sure. You're still sore the next day, and the guys are only getting bigger. You're only making more hits, and you're only practicing more. Like, yeah. Go ahead. You're the athlete here. Tell me if I'm out of bounds.
This is directly at Kyler Neal. Back in the spring, when this debate was every week, it was like, oh, are these teams that are dropping out, are they doing it? Are they going to benefit in the fall? And he was like, hey, when I was 20, I could do this. And I remember Matt coming out and saying, like, okay, this football seasons are tough on the body. Like, it's not just, a night out and then, not sleeping for more than 2 hours and then hopping up the next day and going to work. Like, this is, you're talking about.
You're not comparing a hangover to,
but
to an
you're
ice
talking,
bath.
Yeah, exactly. 10 straight weeks of going out there and, taking hits that, we're finding out a lot more about the long-term effects of them. Like, it's a totally different situation. And so I do think we revisit this topic in 7-8 weeks and go back and look at who won the early season matchups. I think you see some teams that played in the spring win them. But the later in the season we go, if you get into the conferences that had 2 or 3 people sit out, or like the Southland who had a couple teams play and then a couple teams decide to sit out. Some of those are whack teams now. But look at those games later in the year, and I think you'll see, first of all, or earlier in the year, you're seeing teams that played in the spring do well. Later in the year, I think you start seeing them injuries rack up. You start seeing the rust shake off of the teams that played, or that didn't play. And I think that's where the trend starts moving.
Yeah. So, you basically heard it here first. I'm committing to the FCS fans. I'm going to actually update this little spreadsheet I started as the weeks go on of all these direct matchups and probably every team that didn't play's record. And we'll compare at the end. Have some data, analytics we're able to roll with this. We'll have Will back on. So this should be titled Rest vs. Rust Part 1. The continued story, right? And then when this season goes on, and you're right, we get some of these conference games, we get to kind of maybe even into the first couple rounds of the playoffs where you see, like, okay, like, are some of these rest teams hurt or are they not? Like, if North Dakota State rolls in with all 22 starters, possible because they're North Dakota State, but rare for anybody. Like, but how much is the normal? How much further down the depth chart are they? We'll have a better comparison. So if anything, this train wreck of an episode that started with me calling Will Seiler the best kicker out of Moscow, Idaho, who is actually the best holder outside of Moscow, Idaho. We will continue and grow and create a wonderful late season episode for you guys with actual data and analytics. We just set the bed, laid the foundation, and the lumber and everything's coming in, and we're going to build a beautiful freaking house on this rust versus rest argument. But Will Seiler, I want to thank you for joining me for, as right now, the record holder for shortest and worst FCS show of all time. But let the people know how they can interact with you, how they can find you, and what you're up to in the FCS realms of this beautiful little community we all got here.
Yeah, so me and Brandon Owens from Jacksonville, Alabama, have a podcast, an ASUN football podcast. It's called Around the ASUN. You can find it on Twitter at Around the ASUN. And then you can see my Twitter handle is conveniently in the box, also under the box, because Chris has some good editing skills. So you can find me on Twitter at Seiler_Will, and you can come tell me why I was the worst guest of all time on FCS, or whatever you want to say. We'll interact on Twitter. It'll be good.
Yeah, and you can find their Around the ASUN podcast on the FCS Fans Nation Network, or FCS Nation Network, whatever abbreviation Matthew Frazee was able to pin this puppy down to. So when you're done with this, one of those suggested videos at the end will be one of theirs. So go click on it and check it out. And then hopefully I didn't scare you off with the rest of these FCS Football Chris shows. We'll catch you in the next one.